Alara had always been the center of her family. She was a woman of quiet dignity and unquestioning sense of obligation. Despite the obstacles life had thrown her way, she had raised her only son, Keon, carefully. Early widowed, she gave all her attention to him, so he might have a future free from her suffering. Keon grew up brilliant, aspirational, and progressively far apart over the years. Alara had not expected the way the shadows of bitterness and greed would slink into her son's soul, finally starting a series of events that would result in her terrible death. Friends, sorry to interrupt, but please help me reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Let's keep going. Late one evening, a frantic neighbor called saying Alara's door had been left open and she hadn't been seen for days. Her body was in the living room when the police arrived. Bruises on her neck. Her face was twisted in a grimace of terror. Except for the grandfather clock ticking, the house was absolutely silent. Except for the lack of the most recent check from Alara's mother's estate, money Alara had lately acquired following the death of her mother, there were no indicators of forced access or anything out of place. This alone caused her to start to wonder whether someone close to her might have committed the crime. The next inquiry turned fast on the strained relationship between Alara and Keon. For weeks, Keon had been bugging her about his inheritance from his grandmother. Alara had refused to give him any of it, since she felt the money would be better used for something significant than rapidly wasted. The argument had become more ugly by day. One witness, a friend of Alara's from her days working as a historical archivist, remembered a conversation just days before Alara's death in which she confided that Keon had become hostile. "He said some things that scared me," she had said, her voice tinged with anxiety. "It's not about the money these days. It concerns his belief of his entitlement. I do not know him anymore." Keon was hard to find, even though the mounting data pointed toward him. He had left his engineering job and not been seen since his mother's body was found. His social media accounts went dark, and colleagues and friends claimed he had turned away from them months earlier. She felt as though he had disappeared. But a bit of data would shortly cause the research to veer toward a turning point. A discovery in the basement caught the attention of the police as they were searching the house for any clue connecting Keon to the murder. Not expecting much, forensic investigators had brought cadaver's dogs with them. Alara's body had already been discovered. To their astonishment, though, the dogs sensed a little patch of ground close to the far wall. Beneath the ground, they discovered traces of Keon's blood. Though it was an old stain, most likely from an argument, it was sufficient to imply that violence had happened in the house prior to Alara's death. The police speculated that Alara had confronted Keon one last time, maybe in an effort to cool him down or reason with him regarding the inheritance as the elements came together. The confrontation had become physical, and Keon strangled his mother out of a flash of wrath. The autopsy revealed his fingerprints on the neck bruises, so verifying the suspicion. Still, the reason seemed to be lacking. Keon, a man with a steady job, was driven to this point in what way? Examining Keon's recent actions closer turned out a sinister undercurrent. People from his former company said he was progressively unpredictable. He had lost a lot of money on a series of misguided businesses and grown fixated on investments. Keon obviously considered the inheritance as his means of escape from the financial catastrophe he had brought about for himself. His denial of assistance had turned into entitlement and resentment. When Alara withheld the money he so sorely needed, he snapped. Keon, though, was less cautious than he had believed. Among Alara's belongings, detectives discovered a secret phone Keon had given her to keep in touch. There were hundreds of ever more hostile messages on it, getting more hostile daily, sent just hours before Alara's death. The last words were terrifying. "You have no idea what you have done. You cannot stand in my way." Now it was just a matter of locating Keon. The scene was ready for a confrontation that had concluded in murder. He had, however, gone underground, wiping as much evidence of his existence as he could. A set of unusual financial transactions conducted in the days following Alara's death, all linked to a remote, isolated area known for its sparse population and difficult terrain, provided the only hint of his location. Keon's narrative was far from finished, and the research, though encouraging, only touched the surface. The detectives knew that the real depths of Alara's motives, as well as the whole picture of her sad death, were yet to reveal. The only lead the investigators had came from the financial transactions. It was a good one. Keon had made several ill-considered purchases in his haste to escape, including food rations, survival gear, and pricey camping gear, all easily found on his bank records. The detectives figured he was hiding somewhere far off, maybe intending to vanish permanently, somewhere he considered impossible for anyone to find. Following up with old friends and sifting Keon's digital footprint, Detective Mina and her partner, Detective Reardon, had spent weeks trying to piece together his movements. Keon had been careful not to use his main credit card or phone, but his desperation had caused him to be messy. He had made a sizable withdrawal from an ATM in a remote area known for its wide-open terrain and little security, using his true name. People went there to be alone or to vanish totally. Detective Mina was not one to let a suspect vanish readily. She was deliberate, well known for her endurance and respect of the truth. She still felt, though, that this case was more than just a straightforward act of avarice. Keon had killed his mother out of something darker, something buried deep inside his psyche. Alara had spoken so gently of her son before. How could such a metamorphosis happen without anyone noticing? Mina and Reardon examined maps of the region, and Reardon, a former military man with a talent for tracking, started to sketch out the most likely locations Keon might have visited. There were miles of isolated terrain, craggy mountains, and deep forests all over the area. It was a fugitive's haven and the dream of a survivalist. Reardon noted a particular range of mountains and said, "We'll need help. We won't find him without help if he is up here. It's quite risky, too far away." They then called in the search teams, professionals in tracking people across hostile wilderness. The team comprised a forensic expert working with cadaver dogs, taught to find human remains. The team had to be ready for every scenario, even though they hoped to locate Keon alive. Should Keon have injured himself, or worse, should he have chosen to call it quits on his own terms, the dogs would be ready. Days turned into a week as the search teams roved the wild terrain. While search parties searched the underbrush and helicopters soared above, the ground seemed to swallow them whole. Keon stayed elusive, sliding farther from their hands daily. Mina and Reardon kept researching Keon's past back at the station, trying to figure out what had really motivated him to kill his mother. His financial problems made it abundantly evident that he had been spiraling out of control for maybe months, maybe years. But a fresh layer of the narrative started to show up as they perused old emails between Keon and Alara. Keon had not lately become obsessed with the inheritance. It had been fermenting ever since his grandmother died. Although Alara had inherited a large sum from her mother's estate, she had always been thrifty, resolved to save the money for future needs, especially for Keon's future. Keon was unaware, though, that his grandmother had left him a piece of the inheritance as well, subject to his receiving it only once he demonstrated financial stability. Always protective, Alara had kept this from him, since she thought it would drive him farther down his destructive road of reckless behavior and impulsive expenditure. Mina couldn't help but wonder, Would Keon have killed his mother still knowing the whole truth? The hunt for Keon became more intense concurrently. One of the cadaver's dogs alerted something on the 9th day in a heavily forested area close to the mountain base. The smell guided the group to a little makeshift camp tucked under a dense tree canopy. Keon obviously had been living there for several days, maybe longer. Empty food cans, a ripped map, and a sleeping bag soaked in rain were among his belongings, strewn all around. Though he vanished from sight, there was something else. A single ripped piece of paper, tucked within a thrown-away envelope. Though the ink smudged from water damage, and the writing was hardly readable, Mina's spine would have been shivered from the words. I never intended to do it. I wanted her to just listen. The message was vague, but it implied that Keon had been struggling with guilt in the days after his mother passed away. It also confirmed the detective's misgivings. Keon had not scheduled the murder. Driven by irritation and resentment, it had been a crime of passion. Now, he was paying the price for his explosive outbursts of wrath. Although the campsite showed no evidence of struggle, the dogs kept following Keon's scent farther into the wilderness. Hour after hour, hope of finding him alive started to fade. Then the dogs guided the search team to a steep ravine as evening started to set in. At the bottom, hardly seen through the thick brush, was a still figure. Keon. He had fallen, probably in a last desperate attempt to get away from his guilt, or maybe during a flight. Though just barely, he was alive. His face was pale and thin, his leg was badly shattered. He was dehydrated, unable to move, too weak to call for aid. He had been there for days. Mina and Reardon watched as the man who had killed his own mother now paid for his deeds while the medics hurried to stabilize him. Keon would not now be able to flee. Though his mother's and his own life could never be rebuilt, he would survive. And the narrative did not end quite. Keon's trial would soon start, and the world would learn the whole scope of the tragedy hiding under the shadow of a broken family. After his rescue from the ravine, Keon spent weeks in hospital. But the legal system grabbed hold as soon as he recovered enough. Formally, he was accused of killing his mother, Alara. The case attracted a lot of media coverage, not because of its shocking nature, but rather because of the sad undertones of a son driven by desperation to carry out the unimaginable. Keon denied premeditation right away he could talk. David, the ambitious man defending Keon, mostly relied on his confession, the one discovered at his campsite. I didn't mean to do it. David built the story of a broken man, whirling under the weight of emotional isolation and financial catastrophe, and lashing out in a flash of craziness. David said this was a desperate son who had lost control. Not a cold-blooded killer. Not murder. Manslaughter is what we mean. But under the direction of a tenacious woman called Isa, the prosecution presented a quite different picture. She maintained that Keon acted deliberately. He had harassed his mother about the inheritance several times, and when she objected, he decided to grab what he felt was due to him. Her case was strengthened later by his disappearance, which showed Keon was not regretful, but rather seeking escape from justice. Media outlets dissecting every bit of evidence, every moment of testimony, the trial soon turned into a show. Alara's friends and colleagues stood in front of her, outlining a loving mother who had grown more and more afraid of her son's erratic behavior in the months before her death. One of Alara's closest friends related a troubling story about Alara, mentioning Keon's fury boiling over from a recent argument. He is not the same person I raised, she had remarked. I have no idea who he is now. Ever calculated, Isa asked a forensic psychiatrist to testify on Keon's emotional and psychological condition. David objected, saying his client had already confessed clearly of guilt. But Issa's goal was to discredit the defense's contention that Keon had acted only out of transient anger. The psychiatrist disclosed a startling fact from Keon's past, an unreported violent episode from his teenage years. Although this had no direct bearing on Alara's death, it did set a pattern of explosive behavior. It presented Keon as a man able of intense, festering resentment rather than as a victim of circumstance. Still, the most damning proof came from the phone records. Issa painstakingly arranged the hostile and progressively threatening text messages Keon had sent to his mother in the weeks before her death. "You don't know what you've done," the last said. "I will not let you stand in my way," hung conspicuously across the courtroom. Keon had tried to dismiss it as the words of a desperate man, but it was difficult to overlook the consequences of a deliberate deed. Keon's defense faltered as the trial went on in keeping the manslaughter angle. Keon's attorney contended that the weight of his financial catastrophe and his belief that Alara was hiding his legitimate inheritance had driven him to lunacy. But it was obvious this was not a straightforward case of desperation. Keon had become fixated on the money, had harassed his mother for weeks, and killed her when she finally stood firm in her choice. The prosecution's case was perfect. The autopsy report covered Alara's last hours. The bruises all around her neck revealed a protracted and intentional behavior. Keon had strangled her over several minutes, each second a chance to stop and change his mind, rather than in a brief, instinctive flash of wrath. He never did. Issa worked from this to destroy any last defense. "This wasn't a moment of insanity," she said in her closing argument. "One had to make a decision here. A decision Keon made knowing full well the results. Pale and skinny from his time in the wilderness and the weight of the trial, Keon sat silently as the courtroom took in Issa's words. Though the jury's job was to sort through the emotions and uncover the truth, the media frenzy around the trial had portrayed him as everything from a tragic figure to a deliberate killer. The last action the defense took was calling Keon to the stand, a move David thought would humanize his client. That was a calculated risk approach. Though emotionally raw, Keon came across as detached. His testimony was full of contradicting claims about his relationship with his mother. Saying he loved Alara and never meant to kill her, he broke down several times. Under interrogation, though, Issa deftly tore apart his claims, pointing out contradictions in his version of the events preceding her death. Keon's fate rested in the hands of the jury when it came time for them to deliberate 3-week trial. The courtroom was tense as they returned in following just 2 days of discussion. The decision was clear. Second-degree murder guilty. Keon hardly responded as the sentence was spoken, although his face showed a fleeting flutter of resignation. Given Keon's emotional volatility, Issa had argued for life in prison, while David had battled for a lesser sentence. The judge decided at last in Issa's favor. 25 years to life, with parole possibility after 20 years. The courtroom hummed as the reality of the sentence sank over everyone. Keon was hauled away in handcuffs, his future sealed. Although the trial was over, the effects of its result would be felt long after the gavel dropped. Keon's sentence closed a chapter for the legal system, but for the people closest to Alara, as well as for the larger community, her death stayed in a fog of uncertainty and grief. Everyone who had ever known the family had been rocked by the sorrowful fallout from a son killing his mother over money. 1 week following the sentence, Alara's friends assembled for a memorial service honoring her. Held in the same library where she had spent decades archiving history for next generations, the service was packed with subdued tears and whispered memories about the woman they had lost. She had spent decades working in this library. Alara had been a pillar of her neighborhood, always there to provide a listening ear or helping hand. Though her death, at the hands of the son she had loved so profoundly, threw a shadow over every memory, her kindness had touched many lives. The absence of any family members from the memorial was the most moving aspect. Keon had been Alara's only child, and the sense of finality was evident now he was behind bars. Attending the service briefly but leaving before speaking to anyone, Alara's sister, who had been estranged from the family for years, she rushed past the bereaved, head down, avoiding any discussion of her nephew's crime, clearly grieving. For Detective Mina, the case had been among the most personally relevant of her career. She had handled challenging cases before, but something about the very intimacy of this one, of a mother's life snatched by her own son, haunted her. Mina found herself going back to the evidence room in the weeks after the trial, staring at the pictures, notes, bits of Alara's life. The case seemed to refuse to let her go, a continual reminder of the frailty of human relationships and how readily love might sour into something sinister. Detective Reardon, Mina's boyfriend, had already progressed on to the next case, although even he felt the weight of this one. Some people simply break under pressure, he had advised Mina over coffee one morning. But with Keon, it transcends that. True is that he changed completely, rather than merely broke. Those who knew Keon had found his change from a once promising young man to a killer confusing, though even now, people struggled to reconcile the Keon they had once known with the man in prison. Financial ruin, emotional isolation, and entitlement had combined to create a lethal mix. Speaking of Keon, his new house became the prison system. Following his sentencing, he was sent to a maximum security institution where he started serving time. Keon stayed mainly silent inside, not interacting with other prisoners or even the assigned prison counselors. Unlike the man who had once battled so fiercely for what he felt was owed to him, his silence was deafening. His guilt now seemed to weigh him, driving him even more into solitude. Following the trial, Keon's attorney David subtly disappeared from public view. Keon had battled hard for a lesser charge, but his public contempt for him made it challenging for him to argue any sympathy for his client. David had handled contentious issues before, but this one tasted bad. In interviews following the trial, he acknowledged that although he had first thought Keon's guilt and regret were real, as the trial went on, even he started to doubt the degree of Keon's guilt and regret. After the trial, Isa, the prosecutor, came under public notice. Her tenacious search of justice and her ability to put together a convincing story that had resulted in Keon's conviction won her praise. But Isa saw herself as not a hero. Like many others, the case had been a sobering reminder of the limitations of the legal system. Though it was cold consolation for those who loved Alara, justice had been done. Still, Isa's reputation grew, and she soon was assigned to more well-publicized cases. Her career was clearly headed upward. But the community itself felt the most significant influence of the case. Alara's passing and the events surrounding it had spurred challenging discussions on family, mental health, and the corrosive power of greed. For weeks following the trial, local newspapers carried editorials speculating on how things might have gone differently. Could someone have acted before Keon's financial problems descended into obsession? Should Alara have revealed the inheritance sooner? Would that have simply encouraged Keon's self-destructive impulses? Though many people's minds were heavily weighted on these questions, none of which could be answered absolutely. Ultimately, the community created a modest memorial in Alara's honor in a quiet area of the library, honoring her years of service. People could come to consider her life and the need of kindness and generosity, qualities Alara had embodied even in her last days, in this serene environment. For Keon, the years rolled ahead in a prison cell. Though he was qualified for parole after 20 years, few thought he would ever be back in the outer world. Not only had he ruined his mother's life, but also his own. In many's view, that was sufficient punishment. The narrative of Keon and Alara disappeared from the headlines over time, but it stayed carved in the memories of those who had experienced it. It was a warning story of how unspeakable catastrophe might result from love being twisted by greed and desperation. For Detective Mina, the case stayed a terrible reminder of the frailty of human relationships. She understood she would never forget Alara, the woman who had loved her son too much to see the risk he presented until it was too late. Years went by, and the world moved past the Alara and Keon catastrophe. Now visited by people who remembered her warmth and dedication, the library memorial stayed, a quiet tribute to a woman who had given so much to her community. Though the questions about Keon's behavior never completely disappeared, with time the intensity of the case softened. Keon stayed in jail, his appeals run down, his quiet deepening with every year. Though for most, he had become a distant figure, an illustration of what could go wrong when greed, desperation, and broken family ties collide. Sometimes his name would come up in debates about prison reform or mental health. Now, almost retired, Detective Mina occasionally would stroll past the library and consider Alara. Years behind her, the case had permanently changed her heart and career. The narrative was about a family split apart by forces they were powerless over, not only about a murder. And the melancholy of it all stayed even with all the justice that had been done. Life progressed, as it always does at last. For those who knew Alara and Keon, however, the lesson was obvious. The most perilous conflicts are often those fought closest to home, and occasionally, the worst tragedies result from the ones we love most.